this Sunday on Rosemary Barton Live.
We want to bring solutions that Canadians from all walks of life, from all regions, can adhere to.
Gaining momentum after yet another floor crossing, Mark Carney's government closes in on a majority. What does it mean for tomorrow's by-elections? Liberal House Leader Stephen McKinnon is here.
I worry about the message that this delivers to the Canadian public at large.
Leadership concerns. 4 Tory MPs have now defected to the Liberals. Is Pierre Poilievre in control of his own caucus? Conservative MP Shivaloy Majumdar joins us. Diplomatic divorce. Donald Trump questions if the U.S. should exit NATO. Has his threat to withdraw already upended the alliance? I'll ask former U.S. Ambassador to NATO Kurt Volker. It all starts now on Rosemary Barton Live.
Thanks so much for joining us on this Sunday. The Liberal Party is on the brink of securing a majority government. The Liberals will have that chance tomorrow night when Prime Minister Mark Carney's government will be put to the test in 3 by-elections. The Liberals need to win just one of those races to clinch that majority. The magic number there, 172. Carney rallied supporters at the Liberal convention this weekend ahead of those critical by-elections.
This is not the time for politics as usual, for petty differences, for political point scoring. United, we will build Canada strong. A Canada for all, a Canada strong that no one can ever take away.
The Liberals raised their seat count and took some of the pressure off those by-elections when an unexpected MP, Marilyn Gladu, crossed the floor. Over her 10 years as MP, Gladu was known as a social conservative and a strong supporter of her former party. Earlier, I spoke to Government House Leader Stephen McKinnon about how the latest Liberal MP fits into the party and how a potential majority could change the political landscape. Minister McKinnon, nice of you to join us from Montreal. Appreciate it.
It's so great to be with you.
So your party gained another new MP this week with Marilyn Gladu. She's known for being pretty right-leaning with social conservative views. I'll just give some examples for people who don't know her. She opposed the legalization of cannabis. She was going to allow private member bills to restrict abortion. Tell me how those views fit into the Liberal Party that you belong to.
Well, the Liberal Party that I've spent my life serving is the party that wants equality for women, obviously, women's right to choose, has always stood for human rights. That's the party that is a home for anyone who chooses to join it and to adhere to those values, as well as the platform that we ran on and the leadership of Mr. Carney. And I have absolutely no doubt that Ms. Gladu, who we welcome to our group, who we welcome to the Liberal Party of Canada, is going to be a very, very strong supporter of all of those things.
It is, I think you would recognize, as a longtime politician, it might be hard for Canadians to wrap their heads around that, how a person could have some of those beliefs and values and then decide in conversations that she's willing to accept what you call liberal values going forward.
Well, look, Ms. Gladu is also known, I think you're selling her a bit short. She's also known for reaching across the aisle. She's managed to pass 2 private members' bills as an opposition member of Parliament. She has a long business career. Is actually quite well liked by colleagues from all sides of the House. She should not be reduced to a caricature of one moment or another. She is a very, very productive member of Parliament from a very, very important part of our country, Sarnia-Lambton, and we're very, very keen to have her and her talents added to our group.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that she's very likable and that she wants to work across the aisle. What I'm saying is that she has previously, and not very long ago, held views that are diametrically the opposite of what your party represents. And she's now putting those views aside because she wants to be part of the government, I guess?
Well, the Liberal Party is a party of principle, but here's the thing, Rosemary, and you and I have discussed this before. Canadians who live in conservative ridings are looking at their Member of Parliament and saying, what are you doing to be part of the solution? Canada, like many places around the world, we look at world events We look at major changes going on in this world. They see Mr. Carney with a strategy, the right strategy for Canada, and they look at those members of Parliament and say, what are you doing to be a productive member of Parliament and be part of the solution? And that is a very, very appealing thing to many people who live in Conservative ridings, including some of the MPs for those ridings. Then they look at the alternative, Mr. Poilievre, and see someone who likes to reduce very serious issues to sound bites. Seems to have a lot of difficulty getting his party behind him, and by that I mean his parliamentary caucus behind him in terms of some of the strategies and communications that he undertakes, and that's been a source of frustration for many Conservative members of Parliament. I don't think those are deniable things, and we're, for our part, going to continue on the path and on the strategy that Mr. Carney has laid out, building Canada strong. You saw us announce a major port expansion in Montreal last week. We are going to continue with those kinds of things, and I think Canadians are responding to Mr. Carney's plans and policies in very positive ways.
I certainly understand that the context you're talking about, and Canadians do as well, but the role of the official opposition is awfully important as well, I would argue, inside the House of Commons, to make sure that the government is committed to following through on the things that it promised, or to try to improve legislation. So, I mean, it sounds to me like you're sort of downplaying the role of Conservatives in some ways. The Conservatives have an important role to play as well. Yeah.
Of course they do, absolutely, and many people are looking at this opposition, which has spent a lot of time, it must be said, obstructing committees and engaging in reducing issues to caricature rather than debating seriously on the issues of the day. This is up to them to manage, but the role of the official opposition and all opposition in the House of Commons is, particularly in a minority parliament, is absolutely essential. I think people are frustrated with how that effort has been led on their side of the House.
Okay, well, you mentioned a minority parliament. Technically, as you know, you have a majority, but of course these three by-elections on Monday will solidify things one way or another. What would that change, do you think, for, I mean, I know it would change practically, but in terms of how you get the agenda through the House of Commons, how would that change how you would do your job if you had the majority?
Well, Canadians sent a parliament back after the last election, Rosemary, that was very close to a Liberal majority. One or two seats on either side, I don't think will change our duty to be unifiers, our duty to reach across the aisle of the House of Commons, to work with other parties on solutions. We've found some success at that in the last few weeks. We've passed the Budget Implementation Act, as you know, some other important legislation, including crime legislation. So we've made a lot of progress. We'll continue that impulse of working across party lines. We think the times require and demand that we work with other parties on these solutions. We want to be a unifying government. We want to bring solutions that Canadians from all walks of life, from all regions, can adhere to. So I don't think anything about Monday changes that.
I'll just end on this. We have reported there's as many as 9 other MPs who are in some sort of level of conversation about joining the Liberal Party. Should we expect more people? Do you think those conversations continue?
I'm not going to speculate on any of that. I certainly can't confirm that kind of speculation. What I can say is that there are, as I just described, people who look longingly across the aisle of the House of Commons, see a party, a Liberal Party, a Prime Minister engaged in very, very important policies for a very, very serious moment. And there is some dissatisfaction on that side of the House. I don't think that's any secret. But we're going to continue doing what we do and building Canada strong.
Government House Leader Stephen McKinnon, thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you, Rosemary.
This potential Liberal majority has, of course, come at the cost of several Conservative MPs. So far, 4 MPs have defected to the governing party. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says those MPs should have to run again in a by-election.
Mark Carney is saying to Canadians, your vote does not count, that he will overpower the decision that you made through dirty backroom deals that give him unrestrained power to raise your taxes and increase your costs. I feel badly for Ms. Gladu's constituents. She has said that members of Parliament that flip parties after they were elected promising to be in a different one should be forced to run in a by-election. I couldn't agree more.
This comes, of course, as the Liberals gathered for their convention in Montreal, as we were just talking about, where they welcomed Marilyn Gladu, their newest member. And those Liberal sources continue to talk about more names to come, getting ready to cross the floor. Earlier, I spoke to a Conservative Alberta MP, Shuvaloy Majumdar, about the state of the Conservative Party. Shuvaloy Majumdar, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
Okay, well, so we'll start with this fourth Conservative MP who has now joined the Liberal caucus, Marilyn Gladu. I think you would agree, a little more right-leaning than the other people that have left caucus, and I wonder what you think that says about how people are feeling inside Conservative caucus.
Well, more importantly, I think a lot of these people, our colleagues in the House, are going to have to answer to the people that elected them. There's this particular compact that you get, and I'm only a new member of Parliament. I've been around for 2.5 years. But I've looked at a lot of our constituents right in the eyes and made a commitment to get the job done for them on their issues. So they're going to have to go back home and have an accountability with their people and explain to them why they did what they did and betrayed that confidence. It doesn't serve our democracy well to have this type of bait and switch happening, and ultimately these caucus members that have decided to cross are going to be held accountable by their own people.
I mean, that's totally fair, but surely there is also a message for the Conservative Party and your leader in this as well. Because 4 it's a big number in a short period of time.
I worry about the message that this delivers to the Canadian public at large. Here's a country that has profoundly deep questions about trust in their institutions, trust in their democracy. And our democracy resulted in a narrowly contested election in which they wanted a minority Liberal Parliament constrained by the constructive ideas of a Conservative opposition, an energetic Conservative opposition. It was a very contested election. That's what our democracy reflected, and that's what's being undermined today. And I worry about the lack of trust that this is going to introduce more widely in the public, the lack of faith in delivering on the promises that parties have made, and especially for the priorities that we delivered during the campaign. Every major issue that Conservatives ran on became a consensus in this country. And this government has had the support of Conservatives to move major decisions on hard issues.
Yeah, but you're kind of making the other point here, and that is if the Liberals are borrowing, to be generous, some of the ideas from the Conservatives. They're inspired. Yeah. If the Conservative caucus has been supporting some of the legislation because it moves, you believe, the country in the right direction, now we're getting to a point where it's very difficult to differentiate the parties. And I wonder if that's part of the problem, that some people actually see the Liberal Party doing the things Conservatives have been talking about.
Well, listen, for more than 8 million voters that Conservatives now represent, we have not seen a single result on the decisions that need to be taken, not on major infrastructure projects, not on crime, not on immigration, not on stemming.
Well, some of it has started. Some of that stuff has
He's
started.
had a year to make massive decisions to so-called build Canada strong, but he hasn't built anything. And so the decision point that Canadians, I think, are starting to realize is that there's a world of illusions that Carney Liberals are presenting and a relentless pursuit of actually accomplishing results that Pierre Poilievre is advancing. And that's the test. I mean, the Prime Minister himself had said, measure himself by the price of groceries. Well, we have a country now where half our people live paycheck to paycheck. Every report about food bank usage smashes the last record. It's a dystopian landscape out there, and the people of this country deserve a government that's working for them.
Okay, but are you telling me there's no conversation inside Conservative caucus about why this is happening and what you can do to stop more people from leaving?
Listen, our caucus is united. It's focused. We reflect the frustrations.
Well, you probably thought that 3 days ago, and then someone else left.
Our caucus unity has been strong, and when you see the teamwork that we generally have, it's actually quite effective across the country. We have people who now represent from Windsor to Newfoundland, districts that historically have not been conservative for decades. We represent a voice of people in this country who have put their hope on us to deliver the job of advocating on their issues in every single day. And in that, we're completely focused. The frustrations that we feel are the frustrations of our people who wonder why our democracy is being diminished this way.
Well, I mean, for sure, it feels it's being diminished for perhaps the people in the riding or for you, but for some people, they feel that this is actually going to get the government potentially closer to a majority. We'll see what happens Monday night, and enable them to push their agenda forward in a much easier way.
They haven't had much of a barrier. I mean, the issues that Conservatives raise in committee and in Parliament are constructive ones about our civil liberties, about our religious freedoms, about ways in which we can unleash our resources. We've been proactive about all the kinds of legislation that would fix this country over the last year, positions that Liberals technically ran on but refused to act on. So, you know, these power games, these machinations of Ottawa that deny people who are desperate and hurting the actual results that they deserve aren't serving anybody.
Does a majority, if they manage to get to those numbers on Monday night, does that in some way give Conservatives a bit more freedom? You don't have to worry about an election. You can take positions. You don't need to cooperate with the government if you don't want to. You can, maybe it will give you some ability to better differentiate yourself.
I think we've been very focused on being the party that will provide results for the priorities of Canadians. We've been very successful at doing that over the last year. And frankly, more importantly, it's about the democracy that our country has. We're a parliamentary democracy. We have elections where candidates run under parties and are provided results. Our first past the post system resulted in a minority Liberal government with a fierce opposition with the capacity to pull the plug on the government if it decided to cross the lines. Now, the Carney Liberals have completely betrayed that trust. They're betraying the institutions that our democracy
Or your
built.
leader has lost the trust of people inside his own caucus.
I will tell you, the leader has received over 90%, nearly 90% of support at the Calgary Convention just months ago. He is the only leader in this country who is working on the priorities of Canadians and advancing them relentlessly.
Has anyone approached you?
You know, I'm probably single because I'm not sure when somebody's flirting with me, so I may be completely unaware if they were attempting to. But I think what most Liberals would understand is that I'm a fierce and proud Conservative that will commit to, that made a commitment to the great people of Calgary heritage and will honor it in every day.
Okay, but when you, I'll end here. When you have caucus next week and you all gather now without Marilyn Gladu, will there be a conversation about, hey, we just need to make sure we're all saying the things you're saying, focused on those things, and that nobody else is going to go out the door?
Look, I'm more interested in understanding how the Liberal caucus is going to look with Stephen Guilbeault, Laurie Idlut, and Marilyn Gladu all sitting around the same table. It's betraying a party that clearly has no core sense of values. And our caucus, I think, we've had great space to be frank. We talk openly. We have debates. I'm not confident other parties in the Parliament have that success. And I'm confident that we're going to walk in the room united, walk out the room united.
Shivaloy Majumdar, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it very much.
Good to see you.
Donald Trump has been, again, sharing his frustration, this time with NATO's response to the war in Iran.
I have a direct quote from the President of the United States on NATO, and I will share it with all of you. They were tested, and they failed.
I'll speak with a former U.S. ambassador to NATO about the tensions between the alliance and the Trump administration and what that could mean for the war in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. You're watching Rosemary Barton live. This past week, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte met with U.S. President Donald Trump after the president voiced his repeated frustrations about the alliance and its lack of support for the war in Iran.
Let me be absolutely clear. He is clearly disappointed with many NATO allies, and I can see his point. But at the same time, I was also able to point to the fact that the large majority of European nations has been helpful.
According to officials, the meeting was a tense one, with the U.S. president threatening retribution against NATO members. Rutte reached out to NATO allies following the meeting and told them about some of Trump's demands, namely for NATO to play some sort of role in opening the Strait of Hormuz. So what do these tensions mean for NATO? I'm joined now by former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker. Nice to see you, Ambassador.
Nice to see you, Rosemary. Thank you.
I appreciate you coming back. So I guess the Secretary General understood, he said, some of the president's frustrations with the alliance for not being helpful with the war in Iran. First of all, what do you make of the Secretary General saying that and the way he's handling the president?
Right. Well, first thing is that Secretary General Rutte is doing a great job, because his job is to keep the U.S. and Europe and Canada all together and more unified as an alliance. And NATO's job is collective defense, and it's a treaty obligation for everybody. He has to keep everybody together. So doing what he's doing, working with President Trump, is vitally important. Now, when he says that he understands some of the frustration, what I think he's referring to is states that denied the use of ports or airspace or airfields for the U.S. in wanting to project force. Not that countries did not join the United States in fighting against Iran. He also said in that press conference that he was able to tell President Trump allies were surprised. They didn't have a heads up about this operation. There was no common operation that they were being able to slot into. And so it's not really fair in a way to criticize them for not joining. And what we should do is focus forward, and opening the Strait of Hormuz is something allies would support. Now, I'm smiling today because President Trump just tweeted that he's going to blockade the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes.
We're going to have the British and maybe the French or others in there trying to open it, while Trump is trying to block it. So
yeah, I mean, and that sort of illustrates how complicated it is to deal with President Trump. Put aside this move this morning, and we'll see whether he follows through with it. Should NATO allies be engaging in trying to open the Strait of Hormuz and be participating in that part of things?
Yeah. I think what I would suggest is the right role for NATO here. Get a good handle on what the outcome of this war is going to be as Trump sees it. So is it regime change, or is it negotiating with the current regime? And is it opening the strait, or is it blockading it and destroying the regime? We don't have a clear picture of that right now. So that's the first thing, is consultations. Once we see what the lay of the land is going to be, then we can talk about, is there a military operation that would be successful, viable, useful to provide stability, security for shipping, for transit in and out of the Strait of Hormuz? If there is, then I would say yes. I think NATO allies, not as NATO, but as NATO allies, maybe with some coordination, they would be able to participate in a naval operation like that. But we're a long way from where we are today to seeing that happen, because we don't know where we're going.
When Donald Trump talks about retribution against NATO allies because he sees this as a failure on behalf of his allies, or NATO's allies, what is he talking about there? Is it pulling up stakes in some of NATO countries? Is it reducing a military footprint, American military footprint? What do you make of those comments?
Well, I think what he's mainly doing is voicing frustration. And I think in some cases, such as Spain, where he already has a dislike for the socialist government there, they're going to have bad relationship, maybe tariffs, maybe he'll look at withdrawing some kind of U.S. military forces from Spain because he thinks that might be a punishment for Spain. It's actually a punishment for the U.S. military. But he's frustrated, and he wants to vent that frustration. And he also, I think, when you take a step back and you just look what's going on with Iran, President Trump is searching for the leverage that he wants in order to get Iran to capitulate. To agree never to have a nuclear weapon and let the U.S. collect all the enriched uranium, open the Strait of Hormuz, no fees, free passage, all of that. And Iran is not giving that to him because Iran has found that it has more leverage based on oil prices, gasoline prices, the Strait of Hormuz, than Trump has. And that's why I think we see Trump continuing to grasp at things like a naval blockade this morning, because he's looking for that leverage against the Iranians. That is very frustrating to him. And so part of that is also casting blame on allies.
You know, we've talked about the threats he's made in the past about leaving NATO before. He certainly did that in his first term, and he did it again in the second. But he also, the Canadian government does credit him in some ways for getting everyone to meet their targets, yes. Including the Canadian government. But are you worried about the overall impact on the alliance, just given this kind of rhetoric that he continues to have around NATO?
Well, actually, no. I'm always an optimist about NATO because I look at the shared values that the countries have. You know, Trump is a unique or an aberration in American politics, but the shared values of the countries, the shared interests of the countries, the clarity of the NATO treaty about collective defense, which still makes a lot of sense. I'm really not worried about that. And as you said, what Trump has done is prompted other NATO allies to do more, which was needed for a long time, and now we are seeing it. And I think we will continue to see allies do more, and I think that'll be a good thing. And, you know, a few years from now, we'll have another U.S. president who will have another take on things. And I think that NATO is going to come out of this okay.
Okay. Ambassador Volker, it's always nice to see you, and glad you made the time for us today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to see you. Thank you.
Okay. Have a good day. All right. Coming up, we will talk more about what is happening in this country. The leader of the Conservative Party has been reacting, of course, to the latest floor crossing.
Members of Parliament should stand up for the party and the principles that they said they would when they were looking people in the eye in their elections.
Pierre Poilievre taking a strong stance there against the Liberals growing their ranks at the expense of his caucus. What does it mean for his future, his leadership? The Sunday Scrum is ready to get into it. I'm Rosie. We're live.
That reflection comes from the record-smashing 8.3 million Canadians who voted Conservative in the last election, and the 87% of grassroots Conservatives who backed up my leadership less than 90 days ago to fight for an affordable, safe, and strong Canada. Our mandate and my leadership does not come from dirty backroom deals. It comes from the people of Canada.
The opposition leader speaking this past week when asked about if the latest floor crosser had caused him to reflect on his leadership. So what is the risk to Pierre Poilievre at this moment? How can he stem the tide of departures from his caucus? Let's bring back our Sunday scrum. Donna McCharles, the Ottawa bureau chief for the Toronto Star. Sherelle Evelyn, the managing editor of the Hill Times in Ottawa. Jason Markusoff, producer and writer for CBC in Calgary. Good to see you all again. This is sort of the other side of the coin to what we were talking about earlier. Sherelle, what did you make of how Pierre Poilievre handled losing a fourth MP this week?
I mean, the first thing that tends to come to mind as this keeps happening, it's that classic Simpsons quote. It's like, oh, am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong, right? But you do have to realize that there is a bit of a weird positioning here, because as Pierre Poilievre, as we just heard him say, he had received a very large mandate from his base. He is very much liked by the people who very much like him. I believe one pollster even put it as beloved. So it would be a very difficult thing for even caucus internally to now turn the knives against him, to say, hey, things are looking pretty dicey. People keep leaving. One or two could be brushed off as sour grapes. But, before, there wasn't going to be a mass exodus of Conservatives who were unhappy with their leadership jumping ship and going to the Liberal Party of Justin Trudeau. That wasn't going to be a thing. No. Now you have a Liberal Prime Minister who, to hear him tell it, is more conservative than, progressive Conservative Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford. So there seems to be a bit more of a viable alternative for people who don't want to start that process by which, members of the party base against a leader who they are very happy with.
Mm. Tonda, there's also, I think Sherelle rightly points out the disconnect between what's happening in his caucus and what's, how he's viewed in his party. But there also feels, and I know he has to say things one way to the public. I understand he has to look strong. But it also feels to me like there's a disconnect in recognizing what we're all recognizing, that there's something going on inside his caucus that he is not dealing with.
I mean, there's something going on inside caucus. There's also something big going on outside caucus and across the country. Various pollsters right now have the Conservatives anywhere from 6 to 13 double-digit percentage points behind the Liberals. So, the Conservatives, no matter the talk, they don't want an election right now. And they have Pierre Poilievre at their helm. They see the numbers. His net negatives are way far outstrip, I guess flip it around. Carney is net positives outstrip anything that Poilievre is at right now. So I think that what internally, though, and externally for Poilievre's critics is the challenge is that there's nobody willing to step forward and really take the reins of a real challenge to his leadership. So given that, I think that, the talk, like I said earlier, the talk about more floor crossings is real. Mm-hmm. We could expect to see some more. Will that bring Pierre Poilievre or his caucus to a head point in this sort of tension, the internal dynamics? I'm not sure. You pointed it out. Yes, his base is strongly behind him. It is a different base than it was in previous years under perhaps Stephen Harper. And I'm not sure that even if there were to be a concentrated effort to oust Pierre Poilievre, who the logical person would be to replace him. And I think that weighs on the minds of a lot of Conservatives. And a lot of Conservatives really want to stick around and make sure that there is a viable Conservative alternative to the Liberals when the public mood cools, potentially in the face of big cost of living crises that still confront a lot of Canadians.
Yeah. And I would imagine too, Jason, someone who's looking from inside the caucus or outside the caucus thinking, I could be a better leader, I'm going to take a run at it. if you know you're going to be sitting in the benches for 3.5 years, like that does not become as appealing either. So I don't know. It seems hard to imagine that it could happen, but if there's a whole bunch more people crossing the floor, I don't know what happens to Pierre Poilievre in that situation.
I mean, typically speaking, leaderships of a party are solid until they're not. Like sometimes it goes drip, 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 and then a dam breaks. We clearly haven't seen that dam breaking. I mean, we could be on the precipice of, two big, big turning points. One is the fact that there's a majority, which clarifies in people's mind, not that it wasn't seemingly a foregone conclusion for weeks, if not months now, that this will be a majority government, that they will have 3 weeks of running room. Will the people who are staying in caucus, who are not keen to leave, will they start thinking, okay, we have time now, clearly, and runway to rebuild the party? If they conclude that that has to be done without Pierre Poilievre, do they start speaking up? Do enough of them start speaking up? Because a lot of it's been grumbles, private grumbles to journalists who have better access to the people in Ottawa than I currently do, to be honest. But the other part of it is the permission structure that could come with Marilyn Gladue. The fact that somebody who is so far from the progressive conservative fold leaving, does that create more comfort room for people who are more to the middle to say, okay, if she can join the Liberal caucus, I can. Chris Dontram on the House, on a radio show, The House, this week, said, I still see myself as a progressive conservative. So will more people who see themselves as progressive conservative within the Conservative caucus feel more comfortable to leave, especially now that they, as of Monday, they won't be the one person tipping the scales into majority territory?
Yeah, that's a good point I hadn't thought of either. I can tell you that Liberals certainly think that having Marilyn Gladue on their side means that anyone is possible from the Conservative Party. And I would be, if I were Pierre Poilievre, Sherelle, I would be, A, probably not sleeping a lot, and B, sort of actively trying to talk to people to make sure that they weren't going to go. And I don't see or understand that that's happening. Have they?
The Conservatives have been trying to police their own ranks to make sure that people are happy in the fold. Look, to zoom out, the bigger challenge right now is that the Liberal Party under Mark Carney, as I was told this weekend, is basically an anti-Trump coalition. And so, yes, Chris Dontram is comfortable there. Yes, Marilyn Gladue's there. From the Carney team's perspective itself, they see it as a pro-Canada coalition, a pro-Canada approach, ideologically sort of hard to define. But look, that's a coalition. If it's pro-Canada and it's about sovereignty in the face of Trump and trade and defense, the NDP can find comfort within that. They want to push back against 51st state and the lack of an erosion of Canadian sovereignty. So can Conservatives. So that's the challenge for Pierre Poilievre. How do you come at that when, in fact, you're arguing in your speeches, yes, he's making some changes, but he's still arguing that our fate is tied with the U.S. and and Carney's tapped into there's a rupture. So I think it's a really huge wall for him to climb.
Sherelle, I'll give you probably the last word. I take all Tonda's points, but clearly he's not doing enough to keep the caucus happy, because you wouldn't leave if you didn't either weren't unhappy or didn't believe in the leader. I mean, even if the message to Tonda's point is come help Team Canada.
I mean, don't forget, this is somebody who lost his seat in the general election and had to go and rerun in a different riding. And in that interim, he went on, a listening tour, and he did reach out, and he did make a show of listening to people and seeing what he can do differently and seeing how he could be better. And then once he finally, won back his seat and things started gearing up again, I don't know if there was a real big shift in how he actually did things. And now, after every floor crosser, we see a show of fealty, people in the Conservative caucus getting online and proclaiming their confidence, public displays of affection. But the fact that Pierre Poilievre, after every floor crosser, has been able to, read comments made by the defecting MPs that were criticizing the Liberal government mere weeks before, I don't know how much stock he should be putting in some of those proclamations, given that people are very eager and can easily say something else as long as, it suits them in, if they see an opportunity to, get on what they see as the winning side.
Okay, got to leave it there. Tonda McCharles, Sherelle Evelyn, Jason Markusoff, thank you all for spending part of your Sunday with me. Appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Rosie.
Thanks, Rosie.
Thanks.
Marilyn Gladew's decision to cross the floor has not only raised questions about Pierre Poilievre's leadership, it's also sparked discussion around the values of the Liberal Party under Mark Carney. Up next, I'll talk to Eric Grenier and David Coletto, two of my favorites, about how this move is shaking things up in Ottawa and right across the country. That's after the break. New Liberal MP Marilyn Gladue says it's Prime Minister Mark Carney's vision for Canada that prompted her decision to cross the floor.
The big things that he is driving, nation-building projects, diversifying our trade, bolstering our defense, plans to address criminality and build more homes. These are all the things that Canadians want.
Some of Gladue's past comments around access to abortion, conversion therapy, and her opposition to the legalization of marijuana have raised questions about what the values of an increasingly powerful Liberal government under Mark Carney actually are. For more on the latest floor crossing, the upcoming by-elections, and what that all means for polling numbers, I'm joined by David Coletto from Abacus Data and Eric Grenier from The Writ. Nice to see you both again, gentlemen. Thanks for being here.
Good morning.
David, I'm going to start with you because you have a poll out this morning. So I just want to let's sort of set a snapshot of where things are. And I think where things are is pretty stable, pretty not moving, as it were.
Yeah, it really is. We've got, the government's approval rating holding at 54, which is where it's been pretty much for most of 2026. The Prime Minister's personal numbers are plus 22 favorability, which is, well ahead of Mr. Poilievre or Mr. Lewis. And when you ask people how they were going to vote, the Liberals have a clear lead, not as big as some of the other pollsters, but 6 points nationally with big leads in British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario. So yeah, Rosie, I think the picture shows one of stability and one where the Liberals very clearly have an advantage, which I think is helping spark these floor crossings that we've seen and the one from Ms. Gladue last week.
Well, Eric, let me pick up on a point then that Tanja just made, and that is that some people around Mr. Carney are viewing this as an anti-Trump coalition, that's essentially what he's building. And I wonder if that's sort of what you're seeing in terms of the polling numbers and where those issues lie for people.
Well, when we do see, especially in David's polling, for example, when asking Canadians what one of their top issues is, Donald Trump and the U.S. administration is usually one of the top ones. And among those people who say that is a top issue, the Liberals have a huge advantage. So I do think that there might be something to that, especially when you see that Mark Carney's approval ratings are majority. Government satisfaction ratings are majority, sometimes as high as 60%. So I do think you do see some cross-partisan support for both the Prime Minister and the government from Conservatives, from New Democrats, from Bloc voters. So there is an element of truth to that claim. And, you know, we just saw a poll this morning from Ipsos coming out showing that a majority of Canadians actually supported Mark Carney getting a majority through the by-election. So I do think that you do see that there is something to that there.
Well, maybe you want to pick up on that, David, whether you're seeing any discomfort from what people are saying about the idea of a majority and a majority that is achieved in the way that Mr. Carney will likely do it.
Well, I think if you really don't like that idea, it's because you really don't like Mr. Carney.
Right.
And that's about, 1 in 3 Canadians are just under that. So there is a sizable minority who are going to be deeply unhappy come Monday if the government does get that majority and does it in the way that they have by largely poaching members of the party they voted for in the case of the Conservatives. So I think that will create a lot of discomfort. But generally speaking, I think we, in the broader scheme of how I look at public opinion right now, I think what most Canadians actually are looking for is stability, some level of certainty around the world. And if a majority government at least checks one of those boxes and says, look, I'm not going to have to worry about an election. I'm not going to have to worry about the politics getting in the way of us dealing with these threats that are largely external in people's minds. I think that's where most people will land. They'll be uncomfortable with floor crossings. But that uncomfortable feeling won't overcome the desire for a sense of certainty and stability.
Let's talk a little bit about the by-elections. You can make projections or predictions if you want. I think we would expect the Liberals to pretty easily hold the 2 in Toronto. So it's really the Terrebonne by-election that, in my mind, isn't settled. What do you think we might see tomorrow? What are you watching for?
Yeah, absolutely. The 2 Toronto ridings are absolutely safe ridings for the Liberals. They won it by huge margins in the last election, and poll after poll is showing that the Liberals are doing very well in Ontario. So expecting that they'll get those 2, which will put them over the 172 seat mark needed for majority. Terrebonne is really the question mark. It was decided by 1 vote. In the last election, we haven't really seen an indication of huge movement in Quebec. The Liberals still lead by a lot, but they won Quebec by a lot in the last election. So we don't really know what's going to happen there. It's clear that both parties are putting in a lot of effort. We saw at the Montreal Convention that Tatiana Auguste, the candidate for the Liberals in Terrebonne, was one of the introduction speeches for Mark Carney. So clearly they want to put her front and center. They want to put as much effort into that riding as possible because, yes, they might already have the majority through Toronto or the 2 Toronto by-elections. Every little extra seat is going to matter over the next 3 years. So I think they want to make sure that they pick up one on Monday.
What about you, David? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it echoes what Eric said. I think they're going to win in Terrebonne tomorrow night. We may not find out by tomorrow night because of the write-in ballot situation, but I think it's going to likely be close. And I mean, the only indicators we have are what the polls are saying is happening in Quebec, and it looks, if not like, but maybe even more favorable for the Liberals than in last year's federal election. So that's why I'm signaling. And turnout's been up, which it's hard to read. Is that good for an incumbent, bad for an incumbent? I'll read it as people know this is going to be a close election, which is why I think it's still going to be one, but one that favors the Liberals.
Okay, I only have about 2 minutes left, but I do want you both to sort of weigh in on Pierre Poilievre's numbers, which don't seem to be improving. Correct me if I'm wrong there, both of you. But and now having lost a 4th MP, it is not a great situation for him. Although the party still continues to hold pretty strong. Eric, you can start us off there.
Yeah, the Conservatives are still competitive, although some polls have them really where Aaron O'Toole or Andrew Scheer were in the previous two elections, which I don't think the Conservatives think was a winning result. Pierre Poilievre's own numbers remain pretty poor, especially compared to Mark Carney, but they haven't been getting worse. If anything, they might be getting a little bit better in terms of his unfavorables, maybe in part because of the new tone. But I think the biggest problem for him is that he's had a series of bad news, and the polls just keep on kind of hammering that bad news. And the three by-elections, they're not competitive, any of them, but they're also not going to be good news for him if the Liberals, as expected, get their majority.
Last minute to you, David, on that.
Yeah, I think for Mr. Poilievre, it's all in relative terms. He is up against what is right now a very popular prime minister, leader of the Liberal Party, and so everything in comparison is going to look pretty bad. I look at a historical lens on this, and I say, well, Mr. Poilievre isn't as unpopular as Mr. O'Toole or Mr. Scheer were at the quote near the end of their leaderships, but he is polarizing. He's not finding or converting anyone who wouldn't otherwise vote Conservative to his cause, which remains always his biggest barrier. Can he solve for it? I don't think so. Does he need to? Well, in the current context, he would. But again, as long as Mr. Carney is polling plus 50% favorable numbers, it's a world that any opposition leader, I think, would face a daunting task with.
I know you guys will be up very late tomorrow night, just like me. We'll hope it's not too late. Thank you both very much. David Coletto from Abacus Data, Eric Grenier from The RIT. Nice to see you both. Have a good rest of your Sunday.
Thanks, Rosie.
Bye, guys. We will, of course, have extensive coverage of tomorrow's federal by-elections, starting at 8 p.m. Eastern right here on CBC News Network. We'll talk to reporters in all 3 of the ridings. Our decision desk will be ready to make a call once votes come in, and we will break down what's at stake. As Mark Carney's Liberals inch closer to a majority, that will be a big night. Lots of coverage on power and politics with David Cochrane, who is back tomorrow and will be with me for that special tomorrow as well. Look forward to seeing you for exciting by-elections. Thanks for watching.